Welcome to the Lawyer, Money, and You. I'm Roberta, Saphire, an attorney in Sharon, and this is a very important episode. We're talking about the coronavirus, and we have with us a guest who is really more than just a doctor. He's a scientist, and I'll let Camille tell you a little more about him, and thank you so much for tuning in and for watching this. This is going to be Corona 101.
Hello, and I'm Camille Barron, a healthcare advisor and financial coordinator, also in Sharon, Massachusetts. And we are fortunate today to have Dr. Stephen Ross, an internist and concierge medicine provider who specializes in special care for people above and beyond just his role as an internist. And in one aspect of what he's very interested these days in sharing with people is the wealth of knowledge that he's accumulated about this nasty coronavirus. So Dr. Ross, thank you so much and welcome.
Yes.
Tell us what you have, what some of the most important things are that you feel people need to know today about the coronavirus.
Well, I think the coronavirus, which is a relatively new virus, which we don't know a great deal about since it came out of China, is the fact that it is very infective and it is also very dangerous, much more so than the flu. We estimate that the mortality rate of the COVID-19, which is one of its names, is about 10 times more lethal than just a flu virus. And its infectivity is probably at least 3 or 4 times greater.
And why is that?
Well, let me just explain a little bit about how the virus works. So we have cells in our body that make different, they're like manufacturing plants that make muscle cells, red blood cells, and collagen cells, and skin cells. And they're all run by a chemical software that's called our DNA. Now what happens is viruses, in one way or another, can penetrate these cells, and they can hack in and take over the chemical software machinery that normally makes things that we need. And what it does is it just makes copies of itself. And after it's finished using the cell up, it discards the cell. It's dead, it's dead, and and the debris, clogs up. In this case, the tracheobronchial tree, and is one of the factors that leads to pneumonia and respiratory failure.
Doctor, do people's shoes carry this virus? I know they say to keep a distance and social distance, but what about the shoes?
Well, I'll start. First, let me talk with the main spread is through aerosolization when people cough or they sneeze. And what happens is when you cough and you sneeze, it's almost like taking a spray can that you're spraying things in the atmosphere to get rid of an odor or spray paint something. But it's much finer particles that you don't see. And that can come from your mouth and go as far as 6 feet away from you. That's one of the reasons you have the 6 feet, stay 6 feet apart. The other unfortunate thing is the virus can live long enough in the stagnant air, if there's nothing moving it away, for 6 hours. So if somebody coughs in a closed room and then they're leaving the virus in there for 6 hours, and if somebody else comes in there and breathes that same air, that's one of the ways it gets the primary way it gets transmitted, through respiratory droplets that are almost invisible. Also, those respiratory droplets can settle down on surfaces, and if they settle down on a hard surface like or countertop or a railing or a light switch or a button for an elevator, they can actually exist for about 3 days. Ooh. So you can see if you have people coughing and not covering their mouths or coughing into their arms, that they can be spreading these viruses in the air and on surfaces, and it's easy for people to walk through it, inhale it, or touch a button or touch a surface and pick it up. And then if you touch your eye or touch your nose or touch your mouth, it gets introduced into your system that way. The degree of infectivity is somewhat related to the structure and the mutation of this virus, because this virus is in the same family as the SARS virus and the MERS virus, which were respiratory viruses that came out and caused mini epidemics, but not pandemics like the COVID virus. The COVID virus has a stick that sticks up from its surface that allows it to sit on the cells of our body, which are called receptor cells. And these receptor cells are like the lock and key or the entranceway into the cell. And so the COVID virus can grab these receptors and turn the knob and get into the cell much more efficiently than the SARS or the MERS viruses, which are more lethal. The lethality of the COVID virus is only, say, about 1% to 2% of people who get it will succumb to it. And in the picture of that, it's not the young people, because people under the age of, say, 15, there's almost zero lethality. From 15 up to 50, the lethality is probably only about 1%. But when you get to people over 70, the lethality jumps up to 25%. And in one paper that was published by the doctors who analyzed, that nursing home in Washington where about 15 elderly patients died, almost every single one of them, one of their comorbidities was diabetes.
Oh, really?
So diabetes is known, if your sugar is out of control, when you have high sugar, it suppresses your immune response. And that might be one of the reasons that people who have,
How about a young person with diabetes?
They would be more susceptible to getting and not being able to fight off the infection. But because of their youth and their regenerative properties, they probably are not going to die from it. They're just going to be sicker a little bit, and sicker a little more severely and a little longer. The other thing about the people who died, a lot of them had heart failure or atherosclerotic coronary artery blockages with minimal heart failure. So they didn't have any cardiac reserve to really respond to the increased demands for energy and circulation due to the virus. The other thing I wanted to point out was that, let's see, I wrote down a few little notes here. Let me just review here. Okay, so what happens is when you get the virus and it's more than just a cold, there's some people, unfortunately, can walk around and be asymptomatic carriers. That's why you'll remember sometimes if you go in for elective surgery, nowadays to look for bacteria, not viruses, but like the MRSA bacteria. You'll have your nose swabbed before you go into surgery, and then you wash your whole body with antiseptic before you go in for surgery. Those are because some people are asymptomatic carriers and you really can't tell who they are. Then there are people that have minimal diseases like coughs and runny noses and don't get a fever. And then you get some people who have a flu-like syndrome where everything is going to really hurt and they're going to have feverish and they're going to feel like, the old expression, I felt like I was going to die, but they don't die. It's just they feel horrible. And then the most severe ones get the pneumonia, and it's a viral pneumonia that isn't like a bacterial pneumonia, which just goes into one lobe usually. It goes into multiple lobes, and that's one of the things that can distinguish whether you have a pneumonia from the coronavirus or a bacteria, because when you take a chest x-ray, you see multiple spots of pneumonia or multiple lobes, versus in a bacterial pneumonia, it's usually in one lobe.
And the pneumonia itself is bad enough in one lobe. Imagine how bad it must be when it's in multiple lobes.
Right, so when those people suffer from respiratory failure, that means they have so much pneumonia that they can't get enough oxygen into their blood from just breathing the normal air, which is like 21% oxygen in our atmosphere. So then they get intubated on a ventilating machine, and then they can get up to 100% oxygen, which forces the oxygen into their blood, and it keeps them alive long enough for hopefully their immunity to fight off the infection.
But there's here I go again. I'm sorry, I'm an interrupter. But are there certain climates that it can't live in, like in they're saying, oh, when the summer comes, it'll go away.
I personally think that the reason that people don't get sick in the summer is that they're out being active and they're socially distancing without actually consciously really knowing they're doing that. Because there were, I think there has been some epidemics in Australia and other places where the weather has been warm. So it's not just the warm, whether it's cold or warm. I think it's the factor, like take a look at New York. Why has New York got half of the infections and half of the mortality? It's because people are stacked one on top of another. I mean, if you've been in New York during a busy season, you can't walk down the sidewalk without bumping into people and squeezing by them, right? Mm-hmm. That's the population density. So if you have a dense population like in New York or Los Angeles or Chicago, or any of the big cities, you're going to get very fast spread and contagion of that infection. Whereas if you're in the suburbs, where like Sharon or other places, people will get sick, but you're not going to get what's called a steep curve. So that was one other thing I wanted to bring up with respect to, you hear this thing about flattening the curve. So if you measure anything biological, whether it's height versus a population, or the rate or the degree of infectivity of a biological population, it follows a curve called a Gaussian distribution that's like a hill. So if you have a lot of people who are together, packed together, you're going to have a sharp elevated peak like a mountain. Whereas if you spread people out and they don't contact one another and they do the hand washing and the social distancing, you'll have a flattish hill. Like, the difference between, say, Mount Everest and the Blue Hills, okay? Mm. So that's why they want to have, but when you look at all the people that get sick, it's the same amount of people that get sick. So the distancing doesn't totally decrease the population that's going to get sick. It just decreases the rate at which they get sick so that you don't overburden the hospitals and they can keep up with the staff and the respirators and those things.
Well, they're very short on ventilators that I'm hearing everywhere. They're very, very short. And that's a critical piece of equipment, especially for older people.
Correct. But once you get to the point of being on a ventilator, the chance of you getting off the ventilator goes, or making it through the infection goes down dramatically. So that means you're very sick and your lungs are barely working and you need that assistance to keep things going until hopefully your body can regenerate and your immune system can fight it off. Mm-hmm. So getting back to the immune system is a double-edged sword. Most of the time it's a blessing in a young person, because one of the first things that happens when you get an infection is you get a rush of white blood cells that are like killer blood cells that go after the virus and eat it up and gobble it up. So it's like, a battle going on. Then the second thing that happens is, and it takes a little bit of time, there are other cells that make antibodies, which are intricate proteins that when you actually look at them, they almost look like lobsters, because what I would call the arms of the protein are specifically made to recognize the enemy, which in this case would be the COVID virus, grab it and wrap around it and get it ready to present to a second wave of white blood cells that are recruited to eat it up and get rid of it. And then thirdly, you get another response called the inflammatory response, which opens up the permeability of blood vessels and recruits more white blood cells to come in and fight off the infection. However, what seems to be happening in some people, and especially in the older people, is that this third wave of the response, the inflammatory response, is too great. They're calling it a kinin, K-I-N-I-N storm, kinin being one of the inflammatory proteins that makes the blood vessels more permeable. And what happens is that the blood vessels in the lungs become too permeable to fluid, and some of those, what we call the alveoli, where the oxygen is exchanged, they get flooded. So it makes the respiratory failure worse. That's why they're trying some of these experimental drugs like the hydroxychloroquine, or what's the trade name is Plaquenil, has been used in the past not only for malaria, but for rheumatoid arthritis, because it has anti-inflammatory properties and it might be preventing the inflammatory response, on that third wave.
What progress are they making on that?
Well, they just started. See, we only have what's called anecdotal stories from doctors overseas, especially a French doctor who has like 100 patients, and in his experience, he states that he sees shortening of the illness and decrease in the amount of viruses that are shed from people who have had the disease. However, that's not scientific. That's like telling stories. In order to know if something is real, you have to do what's called a double-blind crossover study, where you have a population of people that's big enough where you give placebos to some and the medicine to others. The patients don't know who's getting it, the doctors don't know who's getting it, and you wait a certain definitive time, like in this case, it would be 2 or 3 weeks. And then you analyze who got better, who didn't get better, and you unblind and let everybody know who got what, and then you analyze the statistics.
Are they doing that now?
They're doing that now, and they're doing that now in New York. And I think they also probably started that in Washington State as well. And once you get this done, if it turns out that, yes, statistically it really works, then it will be prescribed by doctors at the first sign of, like if you get the flu now, there's something called Tamiflu, which is an antiviral. It doesn't work the same way that Plaquenil would work, but it actually blocks the viruses from reproducing. And if you have the regular flu and you get the Tamiflu within 48 hours, it's shortened, the fever will go away quicker, and you'll only be sick, for 4 or 5 days rather than 7 or 10 days.
Well, what happens with these people who test positive and then a week later they test negative and they're fine?
Well, they may just have an asymptomatic, low-grade amount. A lot of it has to do with what is the load of viruses you're exposed to. If you run through a hose quickly, you're not going to get very wet. If you walk through the hose slowly, you're going to really get wet. So that's the amount of, getting just a few viruses versus getting a lot of viruses. So it has to do with the quantity of infection that you're exposed to, and then also the severity of what's called the virulence of the virus, and also your immune response. Some people have better immune responses and fight things off, and others don't. So that does bring me to one other thing I wanted to mention, although I should mention to you that the shoe story, if someone sneezes on your shoes, you're going to be carrying that virus around. And if someone picks up the shoes and wipes their nose or rubs their eye, they can give themselves the corona from the shoe. But
what happens when you got to go shopping?
Oh, well, they say that the virus can last for up to 4 hours on cardboard or possibly the paper sacks that you're bringing things home on. So, and I'm not recommending anything, but I'm saying people who are very, how would I put it, type A, and want to make sure that they're doing everything right. Sometimes don't bring the bags into the house, take the groceries out, spray them down with Lysol or something, wipe them out, and then put them in and leave the bags outside.
I'm not type A.
Some people also, if you come in from the outside and you've been out shopping or something like that, it probably wouldn't hurt for you to change your clothing, wash them in hot water and soap, and then take a shower to make sure anything that got on your skin or your hair or something like that was washed away. But that's going the extra mile. I mean, just simply one of the things that protects, I mean, anything that you leave outside is going to decay and not survive due to various bacteria that are out there in the sunlight that breaks it down. So the coronavirus has a fatty, what they call lipid layer on it that sort of protects it. And one of the things that washes away lipids, of course, is soap. And that's why if you're washing hands with soap, not only are you washing the viruses off, but you're washing their protective coating off, and they're not going to survive the hours on the surface or anything like that. They're going to be gone.
I read one of the recommendations I read was that the reason they're recommending 20 seconds is because that's how long it takes for that soap to break down those lipids on the virus.
Yeah, that could be. I don't know. I haven't actually studied that in detail.
Lipids? Is that Lipids?
Yeah,
it's a fat substance, right?
Is like a medical word for fat.
Oh.
Lipids fat. It's lipids are fat. So it has a fatty coating on it. So the other thing I wanted to mention about other drugs to try to fight this off. There are some drugs that they're investigating to prevent the spikes of the coronavirus from sitting on those receptors or getting there first and blocking them. And some of those are the azithromycin may be working more like blocking the receptors and preventing the virus from opening up the door and getting into the cell and reproducing itself. And there's also an interesting
what
thing.
was that? What was that drug? Streptomycin?
That's the azithromycin, the azithromycin.
What is
common-
that? Is there a common name for it? Like
Yeah, Zithromax or the Z-Pack. That's what a lot of people get that for, sinuses, sore throats, earaches, things like that. And then finally, they're even looking at something, one of the blood pressure pills that's very common, lisinopril or losartan, blocks the virus from sitting on the receptor and opening the door and getting in.
lisinopril. Why does that sound
Lisinopril.
familiar?
Yeah, that's
It's
one
a
of the
blood
most
pressure.
one of the most common, the 10 most common medicines prescribed in the world.
Oh yeah, that's the blood pressure.
So they're looking at all of these different things, and they're trying to do these controlled medical studies to see what the science is. And then thirdly, they're working on a vaccine, of course, to be able to give you a vaccine like they do for the flu, to prevent you from being susceptible. And fourthly, part of that is that those people who do recover, because now they're reporting the people who recover. Those people have made antibodies to the virus, and that will protect them if the virus comes back next year. So that's what they call, if you get a lot of people who recover from it and are less susceptible to getting it or carrying, that's what they call the herd immunity. Have you heard HERD, herd immunity?
I haven't heard that.
So people, the more the virus has been around, the more community total immunity you get and the less contagious it is. So the second time around, because people have had it and fought it off, it won't be quite as contagious because they already have antibodies to fight against it, unless it mutates like some of the flu viruses where you have to keep changing or modifying the vaccines a little bit because the coat that they wear on them, they're trying to put a different coat on and sneak back into it.
What's your educated guess on when people can go back to work or back to school or back to anything?
Yeah, all I can do is point to history. If you go back and you look at the Wuhan viral phenomenon in that city and also South Korea, remember, they discovered it somewhere in December, right? We're not exactly sure because they weren't up front with when they first reported it. So somewhere in mid to late December or early January was the first report of the cases. And then it sort of peaked somewhere in February. And now supposedly the Chinese say in the end of March, they haven't seen any new cases. Although I recently heard that they closed their borders to foreign travel because they're afraid of somebody bringing in a second wave. So based on past history, you got to say that those countries successfully fought off at least the first wave of the virus within a 12-week period.
Well, I think we should revisit with Dr. Ross in another week or so to see what has changed since then, because they've canceled college graduations, they've canceled school, they're teaching now through Zoom. People's jobs and lives are on hold. We're going to have a whole episode about how it's affected not just lives, but businesses, what's happened to the businesses, and whether it's a small, medium.
Yeah, the thing that we might have to do is the virus is not hitting the country in a uniform way right now. As I say, it's the population density centers that are being hit, and probably places in the middle of the country don't have very many cases right now. So one theory is to keep everything shut. Another theory is to contain the places where you have the greatest population of cases, and then open up the areas that don't have the cases, because there's got to be some sort of a balance between the economic damage that's being done and the physical damage that's being done. I mean, you can't keep you can't let the society go down the tubes and go into a major depression by keeping it closed too long. But you don't want to open it up too quickly, where you have a resurgence of the pandemic, or what we might call a series of epidemics in different cities. So I think that there has to be guidance from the federal government overall, but I think the decisions have to be made more on a local basis, depending upon whether the incidences of the infectivity is rising or whether it's decreasing. And if you see the number of cases per day decreasing and the mortality number decreasing, then you know in that particular locality you're being successful, and you may be able to get back to some sort of normalcy, although the new normal is going to still be, maintaining social distances and washing hands and maybe not shaking hands anymore, and being cognizant of not touching your face as much, because it's not just this virus that spreads, but everything from the flu virus to strep throat to the pneumococcal pneumonia germ, they're all spread the same way, very, very closely.
Well, I think we're just about winding up. We're ready to wind up. Our producer said, forget about the "you've got to be kidding" segment. I said this whole thing is "if you've got to be kidding." It's
I just want to share a visual of the power, the impact of social distancing. I found this handy little visual explanation that shows how powerful it can be. Let me just pull that up. Can you see this?
Oh yeah, very good, Camille.
Power of social distancing. So here's one person on the top, and within 30 days, they will have infected 400 plus people. If they reduce their exposure by 50%, within 30 days, they will have only infected 15. And if they reduce it by 75%, it's only going to be 2.5 people.
So in other words, keep away, social distancing.
That is it's a powerful thing that we as ordinary people can do, ordinary citizens. We may not have control over a lot of things right now, and a lot of people feel out of control. That's what causes them so much anxiety. But if there are certain things we can do, like limiting the exposure of ourselves with other people, washing our hands for 20 seconds, and having the information that Dr. Ross provides to us, I think that we are armed with as much information as anyone can be.
Yeah, and people can still go out. Just keep your distance, because you see them out walking, groups walking, but they're all separated. So you don't have to, because you can go crazy just nothing. There are people. But
anyway, I think it's very, very important also to remember to, it's really good hygiene all the time to wash your hands all the time.
Right.
Especially, before eating, after eating, and other normal functions. And then just to try to keep the things that people grab regularly, like doorknobs and lights for rooms, and things that you're touching all the time. It's probably a good idea just to wipe them down with a antiseptic pad or something like that, and it'll.
And you can use rubbing alcohol too, right?
Rubbing out. Yeah, if you get isopropyl alcohol and you put it on a clean cloth, that's just as good as any, if not
That's because these hand sanitizers, they're running out of them. And I've even seen that people on the internet, they're buying hordes of them and then selling them for $20, $10 a bottle.
I think they'll run on the toilet paper.
That's even good.
That one I don't understand.
This is a good time. And then we'll be back with Dr. Ross in the next episode of coronavirus with hopefully much, much better news. And
yes.
Okay.
Hopefully, yes.
All right.
I think that's...
So, I think we're going to have to wrap things up now. Dr. Ross, thank you so much. And we'll definitely want to have you come back periodically just to keep everybody apprised of what's
My
going
pleasure.
on. So to our viewers, you're going to probably be seeing us like this for a while instead of in the real studio. So
next one we'll be talking about what's happening with businesses.
That's right, the economic impact, especially on smaller businesses, but on
Yeah.
all businesses. So to our viewers, thank you for watching, and please send us an email if you'd like more information. We can get Dr. Ross to answer some questions
Yeah,
if
he's wonderful.
you have it, because he's always accessible. He's a wonderful person and the best doctor. Thank you so much. And remember, this is your show, the law, your money, and
you.
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 here we go.